Hi, everybody, and welcome to Book Bites, a special program on our Facebook page from the Wisconsin Historical Society Press, where authors talk about their newly released or upcoming books and share just a little bit about them, just a little bite of information here and there. I'm very excited to welcome our author, award-winning author, Martha Bergland, with her newest book, The Birdman of Koshkonong. It is the story of the life and work of kind of an unsung naturalist from just south of Madison, from Sweden originally, actually, Thure Kumlien. Welcome, Martha. We're getting talking here, I'd like to share the cover so people can see the book we're talking about. This is the Birdman of Koshkonong. You can see some of his drawings. He was, correct me if I'm wrong, a naturalist in the 1800s
Yes.
who
Yeah.
settled in Lake Koshkonong area and began documenting the birds and wildlife and nature all around there, and actually did so much work that still carries on today in terms of documenting our natural environment. Perfect topic for pre-Earth Day. Earth Day is
Absolutely.
tomorrow.
Yeah.
So why don't you give us a little synopsis of who Thure Kumlien was and kind of what his work was all about?
Kumlien was, as you say, a naturalist from Sweden. He came to this country in 1843 when he was 23 years old, and settled in Lake Koshkonong, where he became a farmer. Except that Kumlien was really not well prepared to be a farmer because he came from a very wealthy family in Sweden. And his hands were very soft, although he was good at painting and at playing the flute and at collecting birds and collecting plants. He had wonderful small motor dexterity, but he wasn't good at uh, driving a plow and keeping the oxen in line. So he wasn't well suited for it, but he had married exactly the right woman. He had married, and this is part of the reason he came to this country, is that he could not marry this woman in Sweden. He married a woman who had been a serving maid when he met her in the big, elegant house on a lake of a friend of his. And he met this wonderful woman named Christina Wahlberg. And in the very structured, stratified society of Sweden in those days, a serving maid could not marry a man from the upper class, from an upper class family. So it wasn't going to work for them. And he had other reasons to emigrate as well, one of which was that his good friend, Gustav Unonius, who had come in 1841 to this country and settled at Pine Lake, which is now Shaniqua, Unonius wrote letters back to Sweden, which were published in Aftonbladet, which is the major newspaper in Sweden at the time, and still is actually. And the letters from Gustav, from Unonius, were very important to Kumlien because they told about a beautiful environment, a natural world that Kumlien very much wanted to explore. And so he came here with the right wife, and they did live happily ever after. I mean, they had really hard years, the first years, but she was a wonderful woman. And her sister-in-law, Sophia Wahlberg, came with them. So and you may have something to say about Sophia, but the three of them came together and settled in this amazing place, which I'll talk about more.
Sure, and I want to share. This is actually a page from our catalog, our spring catalog, which features this book quite prominently. And I want to share this because you can see a picture of Thure here in the lower left. This is him much older than
Oh yeah.
when he immigrated here. Um, but it also shows some of the work that he did to document and record what was around him when they did settle here. I want to say that his settlement story, his immigration here, and that of his, as you mentioned, his sister-in-law,
Yeah.
especially is part of the immigration stories that are shared at our Wisconsin Historic Site, Old World Wisconsin. So people who visit there will be able to learn that piece of his story and expand on that story even more with this book.
Yeah.
So it's
Which is
really an
great.
opportunity to kind of walk in someone's shoes and really learn a lot about them. I am wondering if you can talk a little bit about some of the work that we're seeing here. It's the drawings, but you also see that in this picture, he has a lot of, those are not live birds.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk about kind of what he collected and how he shared the information he was gathering.
Sure. The picture of Kumlien that you are showing is a picture of him near the end of his life. Actually, I believe that photograph was taken within months of the end of his life. He was at the Milwaukee Public Museum. He was the first curator and the third employee of the Milwaukee Public Museum. And what you see there is Kumlien working in his workshop, working on taxidermy specimens of the birds of Wisconsin. Um, it's hard to tell from the photograph because it's a bit blurry what those birds are, but at least one is an owl, and they're sort of large birds, and they are probably his own specimens, because when he became the first curator, he was hired to. Part of his job was not only to work at the museum, which had just opened, and he helped set up the first exhibits at the museum of birds and plants. That was what he did. And when he was first doing that, he was also hired to still collect specimens from Lake Koshkonong area. So it was a sort of double job. Part of it was in Milwaukee, and part of it was still in Koshkonong. And he liked both parts of it, though he was reluctant to, in his 70s, he took this job when he was in his 70s, to move to a city when he had lived in a tiny place really on a 40 acres of dirt farm for 30 some years. He was understandably reluctant to move to the big city, but once he got here, he really liked Milwaukee. He liked by then he was a widower. He lived in a boarding house. He which he actually liked, and he walked around and collected plants and birds in Milwaukee, although we don't know exactly which ones. So at the end of his life, this Milwaukee Public Museum job was really a culmination of years and years of collecting plants and birds and some mammals and insects for museums, not only in this country, that is in Boston museums, the early Smithsonian Museum, New York museums and collections. He was also sending very large collections back to Sweden, to his former professor in Sweden, still naturalists in Sweden. And he was also sending things to museums, natural history museums in Berlin, in the Netherlands, and in England. So that this photograph of this old man, and by then he was somewhat sick. I mean, he was pretty sick, because he had been preserving birds for many years using powdered arsenic, which is what they used, what they had to use at that time. And arsenic, as we know, is a poison, and the gradual inhalation of that, though I'm sure he was pretty careful, It killed a lot of botanists or a lot of ornithologists, somewhat slowly, but a friend of his had recently died from arsenic inhalation, and actually, it's possible that that's what killed Thure Kumlien too, was the inhalation of too much arsenic. But he died in 1888 on the job. He had opened a box of South American birds that nobody had looked at for several years that had been donated to the museum. And he was opening that one Sunday afternoon. He was at work at the museum. And not long after opening that box, and we don't know exactly if it was coincidence or just one too much poison, bird poison, too much. But anyway, he was rushed to a hospital and died shortly after that on August 5th, 1888. So, but he started as a collector and he died as a collector.
And the
And that,
breadth and depth of his work are just amazing. I mean, people really talk about um, Aldo Leopold, John Muir, all great naturalists, environmentalists, people who really pushed us into awareness of the natural world, also with a lot of Wisconsin ties.
yeah,
And another gentleman you know very, very well, because you also wrote his biography, Increase Lapham,
yeah,
who was everything, botanist, ornithologist,
he was everything. Yeah,
everything.
yeah.
But they were all kind of contemporaries of the,
Well,
and
well,
hear of them, but not of him. Why is that?
okay, that's a very good question. Um, the reason is that people like Lapham and Muir and all the later naturalists were, first of all, they wanted to be public men. They wanted to have a public presence, especially Lapham. Lapham knew that his role in Wisconsin was not only to collect and know things, but to get this knowledge out to the people. That was his large drive. He wanted to be useful to the people of Wisconsin. So he wasn't the greatest writer, but he was a writer, and he wrote a great deal that was published. Now, Kumlien was not like that at all. He was a great collector and a great observer and a maker of lists and a writer of letters, but he had no desire, as a matter of fact, an aversion to being a public man. He did not want, he had no, and he says that he had no desire to be known during his lifetime. And he was sort of browbeat into writing two essays about what has the plants of Lake Koshkonong area and another one about the history of Lake Koshkonong and what has disappeared. And those are stunning pieces of writing. But he didn't have a drive to do that kind of thing. What he really wanted, but what's interesting is that the essays are beautiful. They are beautiful writing, and they are so informative, and they are completely invaluable as records of what used to be there and what has been lost. One of the reasons that Kumlien didn't want to be a public man is that we have to remember that his first language was Swedish, and he only began to write in English in 1850 when he began to correspond with the great ornithologist Thomas Mayo Brewer in Boston. And it was the letters between Brewer and Kumlien that sort of moved him along into getting some foot in the public world, because Brewer was kind of dragging him towards that. And also he got a lot of practice writing in English by writing all those letters to Brewer and making all those lists that he sent Brewer and everybody else he corresponded with. So English was not his first language. He spoke Latin. He read Greek. He had an unbelievably wonderful classical education. When he taught for a time at Albion College, they asked him to teach Latin as well as natural history, and he did. But his idea of teaching Latin was to speak to, was a very modern one. He just wanted to talk to the kids in Latin. And that was just a little too advanced for for those days. They wanted to parse each sentence and translate everything from Latin into English and back. But Kumlien saw Latin not as a dead language, and he used it all the time, of course, and when he used it to identify in the Linnaean method the plants, particularly plants and birds that he had contact with. He had a really amazing education, and what he brought to this country was probably completely unique at the time in Wisconsin. There was nobody like him. There were other educated men at the time, like Gustav Unonius at Pine Lake and some of the others who came too, but they didn't have the range of classical background that Kumlien had. He was a painter. He was a musician. He brought with him wonderful romantic Swedish songs that he and his friends would sing together. There were some Swedes in that area, and so he kind of, in a tiny way, in a log cabin, recreated the life of a kind of an educated man, even though it was very rude and crude where the way they lived.
Well, you
But
can
it was
go ahead.
comfortable. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you can really see his artistic talent in these
Oh,
drawings. I mean,
yeah.
this is just the tip of the iceberg, right, in terms of the drawings that are out there. Are some of his drawings still at the Smithsonian and the Milwaukee?
Not his drawings that we know of, but certainly his bird specimens are there. There are around 20 specimens at the Smithsonian still listed under the name of Kumlien. Some of their old lists are a little bit confusing at the Smithsonian, and some of them might have been sent. Some of the birds might have been sent by his son Ludwig, and I'm sure some of them were. And that's one of the interesting things about Kumlien, I think. One of the beautiful things about Kumlien is that he was a wonderful family man who passed this education, this multiple levels of education on to his sons. Ludwig was an artist and a musician and a great birdman. It was Ludwig who eventually published the first Birds of Wisconsin with Ned Hollister, but it was in large part based on the research his father had done. And he had a son, Theodore, who was probably more like the Wahlberg side of the family, and he became the farmer who sort of rescued the whole bunch of them because they were artists. And I mean, Kumlien, he was not in it. He needed money, and he knew he needed money, but he was not in it for the money. He would have done what he did, whether they paid him or not. And he had a son, Theodore, who became a wonderful farmer, and he also was a musician. And then he had a daughter, Svea. We don't know much about Svea. Actually, one of the hard parts of this was that we don't know much about the women. We don't have letters from or to the women the way we do the men. And then there was the wonderful son, Frithjof. And this is one of my favorite facts about Kumlien, is that Frithjof, the baby of the family, was a magnificent artist and musician. And he went to the University of Wisconsin, right next door to you, and he was trained as a pharmacist. But when his degree, when he finished his degree and went back home, he told his dad something that that probably would have struck fear in many fathers. He said, "Dad, I don't want to be a pharmacist after all. I want to be a painter." And his father, this wonderful man, said, "You do that." He said, "That's what you are put on this earth to do." And one of Kumlien's last beautiful letters to his son is to tell him to dig, 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 meaning to get deeper and deeper and deeper into this art form. And he said, you must be helped, you must be supported. And he sent him money for paints, for paper, and told Fritoff to be an artist. I mean, that's kind of rare, don't you think?
That's rare in any century, but
And yes,
to some extent, yes, and especially back then, I would think.
yeah,
Well, his legacy not only lived on in his children, but
yeah,
lives on today. I mean, if you wanted to see some of his work or collections, you could go to museums all over the world,
yeah,
the Smithsonian included, us.
yes.
You can check out the Wisconsin Historical
Oh,
Society
yeah, that's the source, really. It is.
and Milwaukee Public Museum, I
The
believe.
Public Museum and the Hoard Museum in Fort Atkinson, which has a room that has a lot of Kumlien's mounted bird specimens in glass cases. And that's on the second floor. It's pretty wonderful.
Well, Martha, what I love about this book most, not only is it beautifully written and a very interesting story, is that it sort of brings back to life the story of this person who everyone in Wisconsin should know,
I think so.
but none of us do. So few of
Right.
us do, and that really is sort of giving him his historical due for the work that he's done. And this book is definitely part of his legacy, The Birdman of Koshkonong by Martha Bergland. You can also check out Study in Wisconsin by Martha Bergland about increased Lapham. They make a good double read over the summer. But you can find them all at your favorite book retailer, your favorite library, or at wisconsinhistory.org/WHS Press. You go to our online store there and find them there as well. Martha, thank you so much for joining us for Book Bites. I'm sure if folks have some questions and leave them in the comments, you can reply with some answers on our Facebook page. And we look forward to seeing you at Book Bites again. It's always the first Wednesday of the month at 7 p.m. We will see you then. Thank you again, Martha, so much.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you.